Welcome! Today we're going to explore the life and painting techniques of Leonid Afremov, but using only crayons. You can follow along with today's lesson if you'd like, or just kick back, get a little bit of history, and watch as I tackle with crayon a replica of an actual masterpiece from Leonid Afremov. Now, before I get into talking too much about the artist, which I will, I'm going to lay some of the framework so that you have a sense of direction if you did want to follow along. So at this moment, what you see me doing is with my orange crayon, I'm just searching for some of the simple shapes that are going on inside the composition, really thinking of it more as a design than as a forest, groups of color. And I'm going to move through the crayons, going from orange to red to looking for purples, blues, and almost looking at it as if it's a paint by number and kind of trying to break out the sections and so that I can go in and more freely express my coloring in the next steps, which that's what they'll be. They'll be to build up my crayon work till it's really nice and thick, and then we'll manipulate it using a little bit of rubbing alcohol and then a butter knife instead of a palette knife, which is what the original artist Afremov would have been using. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Afremov as we go through this. So who is he anyways? Well, if you're anybody who's anybody that's looked for art for your home, he is one of the top sellers on almost every website unanimously. You'll know his work immediately because it's filled with bright, happy swatches of color. Typically, there's a central light source or several like lampposts, or as in today's, a light coming through the trees. And the trees, they cause a nice stark contrast. This is very typical of his work as well, which commonly will be the contrast a lamppost, a bench, say a couple. So this is a common motif for Afremov, is to have these bright, surreal colors and then this stark, almost black sort of contrast so that it really drives in at a quick glance what you're looking at. Now, we call him an impressionist, and Impressionism is a movement that started back in 1875, and so it's been going for quite some time, and so to be able to contribute something new to it is quite actually extraordinary, and he truly has contributed to it uniquely. He's followed in the footsteps of the predecessors such as Van Gogh, Monet, Renoir, Degas, who all have a passion for the mark, for the expression of using paint and seeing paint on the canvas. This is definitely what Leonid brings to the canvas, that same energy, but with almost a bit more rawness, almost a level of expression on top that can almost make anybody that looks at the canvas, no matter what culture you're from or anything like that, and feel a happiness, kind of understand what the artist was trying to convey. So what you see me doing right now is I've basically, using the coordinating colors, done the best job I can looking up at the example and just really following along, trying to block in the big sections, not worried about things like the trees yet, because those can all go over the top of everything I do. I did use a white crayon, and so say the area where the sun is and little areas that you can look up to the example and see snow or sunlight reflecting, I used a white crayon and I colored very hard, and so that later in the work I can take a knife and scrape at it to actually reveal the white again, no matter what colors I put over it. So as you see me coloring with quite about a bit of firm pressure, I'm going right over the spots that I intend to be white later. You can see that it somewhat resists it as I'm coloring over it. So I'm moving essentially through the color wheel as I do this. And in the background where the yellow is, you can see me starting to graduate the orange in, and I'm starting with a light orange and then moving towards a red orange. I've isolated areas where I want the swatches that represent leaves to be, so that I can color pretty hard in those spots. The more I go, the more pressure I start giving with the crayons as well. You can start to see the saturation level increase because I'm starting to look for the contrast now in these areas, now that I have at least an amount of color laid in. Now, the order of which you apply the colors, don't over worry it. I'm basically just looking towards the example and trying to just mimic spots where the colors are, and so that I can have sort of just a rough underlay of which I'll smear a little bit using some rubbing alcohol momentarily, and then go over with final details. So, Leonid Afremov. He was born in Belarus, the USSR, back in 1955. Now, that's a different time and place than we're used to. Back in the USSR back then, it was a little rougher, and he had a hard time being accepted in his family because of their religious beliefs. They were Jewish, and the Jewish people were coming out of a hard time, especially in that area, with a lot of the government and people really persecuting them for no good reason. And so, for no good reason, Leonid Afremov had to face a lot of resistance in becoming an artist in the country in which he lived, which, later became Russia. His parents definitely supported him becoming an artist. His dad was a shoemaker, and his mom worked in a metal factory. He, at a young age, began to study art, and it was said that he did really darn good in school too. Always studying from the masters, and great in just general education as well. Then, after that, he went and studied further, in which he graduated and began teaching. And his passion towards art wasn't exactly what we know him to be today. He was mostly just wanting to be an artist that can make a living at it, which in the USSR at this time was quite difficult. His first job out of college was doing labels for alcohol and wine sales. And so, he just had to do whatever they wanted to go on the label. So, good job using his talents, but not necessarily expressing what's within like we are exploring today. And then he was eventually able to move into the ability to do some jobs for the government in the 80s. And, well, that's good work. It was mostly for plays and doing set design, and these plays were mostly meant to glorify the government further, and as we, were talking about, they weren't the friendliest towards his beliefs in the first place. So there's an amount of Leonid that was being censored just at the get-go, being who he was and born in the time and place he was. And so he had that work going for him, and he would try to sell his paintings here and there, but he'd not find much success for most of the reasons that I have mentioned before, but also because just there wasn't really the market there for art at the time to be sold. And so he then ended up moving to Israel in the 90s, and he made this decision with his wife now, and he had a kid at this point. Mostly just because so many people in Russia at the time, the USSR, were moving, especially those of Jewish heritage, back to Israel. And so you had this big movement in the 80s and 90s, and he became a part of it, searching for that appropriation of his heritage. And so he took that adventure over to Israel, and then again began to try to establish himself again as an artist, right? Reinventing himself. So what you see me doing on the canvas right here with the smearing is I'm taking a little bit of rubbing alcohol, or you could even do hydrogen peroxide. If you don't have either of those two, a little bit of just household glue will do the same. It just makes the paper a little bit more saturated and you gotta clean your finger afterwards. All I'm really doing is sort of what I would think of doing with watercolors. Just blending big color spots, taking any grain I want out, which is not to say that I want to relieve all the crayon grain, because Impressionism is so much about preserving the original medium. And so really I'm just looking to smooth areas so that I can enrich it further with marks that actually do look much like crayons. But either way, it's very cool that you could do this technique. You'll see at this point that you should have most of the composition found and decided by now. You should have a sense of your colors placed, so that now when I go in, it's going and really enriching every area, really giving it a whole entire second go. And that's part of art, right? Is that process that we find ourselves going through. It doesn't just happen immediately, and that's why even if you're not following along with this with a crayon, but rather just kicking back and sort of viewing, then it's nice to see that it doesn't come out perfect from the get-go. Even as me, the artist, going at it, you can see there's that searching process. There's that timid line making in the beginning where the camera has trouble exposing because I'm drawing so lightly, but then I'm getting more confident. That's how this works. And honestly, anytime that you're drawing something that is not your own hand, it's gonna feel a little different. It's gonna feel not your own, but it's important to do because it will inform your own art later. And so back to Leonid. So we find him in Israel, and I believe that he'd moved to Ashad, and this was an area where there were quite several immigrants from Russia, and so that he fit in. But still, even over here, guess what? He still couldn't get the respect that he deserved because he was an immigrant from Russia and not born in Israel. So, I mean, that's frustrating. But still, within weeks, he had a job working at a framing place where he learned to make frames for his art, which he'd never really done before. And something else he'd never done before was painted with a palette knife. Well, little did he know this was what was to be his life's sort of defining tool that he would use. And he did start painting with oils and the palette knife, but still couldn't sell them. The paintings that he was able to sell were just watercolors and really of just local scenery and things like that. Nothing too bright or audacious like we see now. And it was actually with the help of his son going door to door and just going and representing himself that he was able to sell these to his neighbors. And so with that amount of success, it kept him working at it, and he did. It takes about a day for each of these. So imagine I take about an hour and 20 minutes on this, so we're only also trying to do a fraction of what he can do too, and we're using crayons. But still, a painting a day is impressive and prolific, especially considering the price that these eventually end up selling for. And so Afremov opens up a gallery, and it just keeps getting vandalized over and over again because, again, his beliefs and where he came from. And so after so much frustration and it eventually getting burned to the ground, he moves to America. But before moving there, he's smart. He's sending artwork over there to family that already lives in New York, piece by piece, so that when he arrives, he has hundreds of paintings already sitting there ready to be sold. And so he goes gallery to gallery and does find mild success, but also finds that they're much more wanting to take advantage of him really gouge the prices that the money he'll make off of them, and still limiting what they want to see from him. They're really putting him into a niche of being an artist from overseas, and they just want culturally sort of appropriated art from that area. And, waha, we have Afremov. That's not what he was looking for. And so, because of several factors, one being the cold, the other being the cold galleries, he then moved to Florida. Now he's in his 50s, and his son again steps in to help and puts his artwork onto eBay. Oh my goodness, everything he put on eBay just sold left and right, left and right, left and right. Before you know it, Afremov is in everybody's house. He's at big wall murals. He's creating video lessons on YouTube. He is the most searched artist in the world. Every paint wine wants to paint just like Afremov, and no one can. That's the beauty of an artist that makes their own mark and has such a unique voice, is that many people can emulate it, but no one else can quite give that same energy. And that energy he's giving is a happiness. He wants to just show people that, it's not about the subject so much, but about the feeling of common scenes we all see, that we can imbue upon it, that give us this common feeling of happiness that we all know and love. And he's just so good at using that color so boldly in his work. And it is amazing that by 10 years after selling his first paintings on eBay and really getting that worldwide fame, he had 15 artists working for him and reproducing his work and selling it under his brand name, which is, that happens when artists make it big time. So several artists, that is the end goal. So congratulations to him. He ended up retiring early because he had heart conditions over in Cancun, and letting really the name and the company he'd built still live on. Unfortunately, he passed away last year. And so his paintings are still being sold, and those 15 artists are still employed, and he's still honestly one of the best-selling artists today. So thank you so much for coming through this documentary with me. It's been a joy to try to replicate this, and if you went and did this at home, I would love if you shared it with me, and congratulations, because it's a very tricky piece, and I know without even being there that you did an amazing job at it. You saw me scraping with the knife. Most of this is just about building up big color swatches. And so, just remember, go bold, use your darker colors last. Black will go over everything. If you have trouble, if you've built too much wax up, use a Sharpie at the end for the black. It's okay. And hey, until the next time that we meet again, I urge you to doodle on. And you can also check out this video up here if you wanted to just keep it going until then. Hey, and also subscribe and tell your friends and all that good stuff.